Hello, everyone. In the last video, we got started looking at tax burden and deadweight loss. Now we're going to take a look at tax, deadweight loss, and elasticity. So the first question they ask is, how do tax incidence and deadweight loss, or DWL, change depending on the elasticity of demand? When demand is inelastic, QD is relatively unresponsive to change in price. When demand is elastic, QD is relatively responsive to a change in price. The more inelastic demand is, the greater the burden on consumers and the smaller the deadweight loss. Now, this is all very technical and confusing whenever we just talk about it this way, but if we look at it graphically, it's going to be a little bit easier to understand. Here we have two graphs showing before a tax and after for the quantity of phone service supplied and the price of various phone services. Remember, we're looking at supply, so we're looking at this from that producer standpoint. With this first click, we see we have our demand and our supply curve. And in this case, the particular curve for demand is going to be vertical. And our supply curve is going to be our normal looking supply curve that is increasing as that price increases. Now, in this case, we want to know if the demand for phone service is perfectly inelastic. Before we get into that, we have E1 that represents our equilibrium quantity and equilibrium supply, and P1 that's going to be that equilibrium price, Q1 that's going to be that equilibrium quantity. The reason that our demand curve is vertical in this case is that typically each person will only demand one phone or phone service per person. So in this case, it's essentially perfectly inelastic. We see our consumer surplus would be anything above that equilibrium point, and our producer surplus would be anything below. And then we have our right side graph, which shows our market after the tax. So we have our supply and demand curve. Our supply curve is going to shift based on that tax. We're going to move from E1 to E2, meaning that's where our new equilibrium is, and our price is going to move up to P2. But our Q is going to stay the same because people will still require that phone service. Because demand is perfectly inelastic, that means that a price increase is not going to affect the quantity demanded. So anything that's perfectly inelastic, that means that regardless of changes in price, demand will always be the same. The tax revenue is going to be this green area that's shaded in. Our consumers are giving up a little bit of their surplus, and our producers are also giving up none of their surplus because in this case, because demand is perfectly inelastic, they can put that entire burden of the tax from their producer side over to the consumers. So why would the government want to tax a good that had almost perfectly inelastic demand? Well, the reason being is that there's no substitution. The tax will be a steady tax revenue because when goods are perfectly inelastic, that means that people are going to want them regardless of other outside circumstances. Purchases aren't going to change very much because that demand won't change with these perfectly inelastic goods. And because of that, there's little or no deadweight loss as far as the producers and consumers are concerned because people will continue to purchase even though there's a tax. Now, the question they ask here is, what do you think if it would make more sense from a tax standpoint to put a tax on Brussels sprouts or cigarettes? And the answer here is that people will continue to buy cigarettes even if the price goes up, whereas a lot of people probably just wouldn't buy Brussels sprouts if we were to tax those. There's a lot of substitutes. They could switch to a different vegetable or anything like that. So there would be a relatively large deadweight loss in the Brussels sprout market. But demand for cigarettes is highly inelastic. So most of the burden of the tax would fall on smokers, and there would be little to no deadweight loss. So this is going to show you tax and deadweight loss with a product that has somewhat elastic demand. Before, we saw something that had perfectly inelastic demand, meaning that demand would not change regardless of changes in price. But here, with a good that is somewhat elastic, our supply curve will shift. And when that supply curve shifts, the tax revenue will be what's highlighted in green. Our consumers and our producers are giving up a little bit of their surplus. And then this yellow area is going to be deadweight loss, because that's basically an area that we lose completely when we move from E1 back to E2. We were more efficient when we operated at E1. Demand will go down just a little bit, not a lot, and we will end up having some deadweight loss in this yellow shaded area. If a good is perfectly elastic, we're going to take a look at what happens whenever we have a tax and what happens with deadweight loss. Perfectly elastic means that demand will always stay as a horizontal line. So when we impose a tax or before the tax, we always have a producer surplus, but there really isn't much room for any consumer surplus. If something is perfectly elastic, that means that if the price changes at all, consumers will not buy any of this good. So if a tax is imposed, we would have a new supply curve that would be drawn. Our tax revenue would be this area shaded in green. Our producers are giving up quite a lot of their surplus, and then the deadweight loss is going to be that producer surplus that we've given up. Keep in mind, when we say something's perfectly elastic, that means that if that price changes at all, if it goes up at all, the quantity demanded will fall to zero. So let's look at a summary to kind of compare the three cases. If demand is perfectly inelastic, like it was with cigarettes, the burden of the tax will fall on consumers and there will be no deadweight loss. As demand becomes less elastic or more elastic, the tax burden starts to fall more on producers and there still will not be a deadweight loss. If demand is perfectly elastic, the burden of tax falls completely on producers and there will be a greater deadweight loss. Here we have a practice what you know. Deadweight loss can be thought of as surplus that is transferred from producers to consumers and given to, and the answer is nobody. Nobody benefits from deadweight loss. It is completely lost and there is no upside to it. Finally, if the government wants to create tax revenues without generating any deadweight loss, what type of good should they tax? And the answer here is that they want to tax a good that has perfectly inelastic demand, like cigarettes or something similar, so that there will be no deadweight loss. Now, this is where we're going to go ahead and wrap up this video. If you're feeling good about this one, you can head over and watch the video on elasticity and supply and demand. Thank you.